Welcome. We've often heard it. It was hotter in the 1930s than it is today, therefore global warming doesn't exist. Now this video is going to take a look at the truth of that statement from a number of different points of view, but the other thing one has to ask oneself is it relevant? If the circumstances back in the 1930s is not the same as today, then it isn't relevant. If those factors that are causing today's warming are different from the factors that caused the 1930s warming, then indeed that experience is irrelevant to the discussion on global warming. If you Google the phrase 1930s warmer than today, you get something like 400,000 hits, many of them purporting to be proofs that that is in fact the case. Stephen Goddard says a simple proof that the 1930s were hotter and shows this graph. The only thing is this graph doesn't show temperature, so it's a little misleading. Another blog that actually does show temperature declares that the decade of the 1930s was hotter than any year since, except for their graph doesn't show that. What's Up With That proclaims newly found weather records show that 1930s is being far worse than the present for extreme weather. And they show the same plot as Stephen Goddard does, but broken up by decades. Now, one of the things to note is none of these studies go beyond 2014, so they've missed the three warmest years on record, 2015, 2016 and 2017, out of their sample, thus biasing it. But they certainly seem to have this 1930s decade on their minds and use that as an attempt to prove that global warming is not in fact operating. So let's take a look at the data. Here's the monthly average data over the period from 1895 to the present. And here's the 1930s. Now, because there's so much noise on this data, it's really hard to tell whether the 1930s are particularly warm or cold or whatever. So I think it'd be far better here to take a 12-month average of the data and see what happens then. So this is what I've done. And so you can see now that the 1930s do in fact stand out, particularly against what was happening prior to them and perhaps for a few years afterwards. But the data that we're talking about was decadal. What's the decadal average? So what we're going to do is take an average over every 10-year period throughout this time frame and see how the 1930s compare with the other decades. So here is the decadal data. I've just taken the data that we had before and summed it by decade over the same period from 1890s all the way through to the 2010s. Here are the 1930s, and you can see that certainly it is warmer than the 40 years before and the 50 years following. So in some sense it does stand out. However, if you draw a straight line across here, you can see that the 1990s are slightly warmer than the 1930s. The 2000s are significantly warmer, and 2010 is a lot warmer by over a degree. So the 1930s are not the warmest decade on record, they're the fourth warmest decade on record. So I'm not quite sure what all the fuss is about. Now let me reveal what they're not telling you. These are not global temperatures. The temperatures they talk about are from the United States. And they don't even include Alaska and Hawaii. So this is the data for the contiguous United States. If you included the Alaska data, which is shown here for the 1930s, you'll see that it was below average temperature throughout that time frame, so that would have dragged the overall average down quite a bit. And even Hawaii would not have contributed very much to the warming trend. But it's global warming that we're talking about, not United States warming. So here's the global monthly average data. And if you fit a quadratic equation to that, you get this plot, which shows that not only are temperatures increasing, but they're accelerating. Let's take a look at the 1930s, that's here. And you can see there's nothing particularly special about that time. But we did the last analysis in terms of decades, so let's break this down into decades as well. So here's the decadal plot for that same period. Here are the 1930s, and actually overall they're below average. And all the subsequent decades following the 1930s were warmer than the 1930s. So the 1930s are actually the 9th warmest decade on record globally. In global warming denial, anything goes. In the continental United States, in the 1930s, there were some hot years. It was called the Dust Bowl for a reason. But those reasons are not the same reasons that are causing the globe to warm currently, so are basically irrelevant. Here are the US temperatures for that period. Here's 1934, the so-called warmest year on record, but if you draw a straight line across this plot, you can see that there are 6 other years now that are warmer than it. So it's now the 7th warmest year on record. The US represents a relatively small proportion of the globe, so its changes in climate are not necessarily representative of what's going on in the rest of the world. The 1930s were the 4th warmest decade in US climate record, not the 1st. The 1930s were the 9th warmest year in the global rankings. So if you hear somebody spouting on about the 1930s being warmer than the current time, and so therefore global warming is not happening, please post a link to this video and tell them they're talking nonsense. So until next time, goodbye.
Hey, all you Jills,